Today I'm talking with Richard Rayward. Richard's had an incredible 60-year flying and business career, starting off in Venison Recovery in the mid-60s in South Westland and moving on to start his own flying business, Air Safaris, that he still runs today. Air Safaris is an amazing story of opportunities, calculated risks, success and low points, and many interesting aircraft of varying types. I do need to apologise for the average video quality during this interview, caused mainly by my dubious camera skills and lack of specialised lighting equipment, but also due to the thunderstorms, torrential rain and periods of bright sunshine throughout the day. I am investing in more lighting equipment and upskilling myself, but it is a big learning curve. For these reasons, I've decided not to include the first few minutes of this discussion, so we pick up the story with Richard describing his new job as a junior cameraman for the National Film Unit. In fact, maybe I should have got Richard to film this interview. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the discussion as much as I did, and if you did, I'd love it if you like and subscribe. It makes a huge difference to the channel. Thanks. Do you ever wish you'd, I guess I know the answer to this, but do you ever wish you'd, or think, I wish I'd stayed in that film industry?
I've often wondered about that, but as I've mentioned, it was a wonderful job for a young single guy. It's exciting, meeting lots of different people. But it was, and then on that job down at Queenstown and Manapuri, I met Rosslyn, who was working on a working holiday from Australia with a couple of friends, and we had a bit of a whirlwind courtship, and eventually I managed to convince her to marry me. Went over to Australia, met her folks, got married and brought her back to Wellington, and that's where things changed a bit, because I'd had this really exciting life all around New Zealand. We'd been snow caving in the Tasman Glacier and the Fox Glacier, and filming a lot around the Mount Cook area, and various other quite exciting jobs, and meeting a lot of different people. And it was a wee bit disturbing at times that you would get very close to somebody for a week, something like that, never see them again.
Yeah.
And I found that a wee bit disturbing. So anyway, I talked her into marrying me. We came back to our little flat in Wellington, but it wasn't much fun for her with her new husband away 90% of the time. And so we started to talk about what else could we do that would keep us together.
Yeah.
And it was about that time that a great friend who'd been involved in the climbing film that we did, which involved quite a lot of filming on the Tasman Glacier, and also saw the culmination filming a climb to the top of Mount Aspiring, where we had some very patient climbers nursed us up to the top of Mount Aspiring.
Wow.
And we perched on top and filmed there. And one of the climbers was a chap by the name of Bruce Jenkinson, who was a very talented and much respected climber, mountain guide, and we became very good friends.
That must have been, just thinking of the technical side of doing that, one, I guess you're not a climber.
Yep.
You're carrying a lot of what we see now as old, heavy equipment.
Yep, but very.
That must have been pretty challenging. And the other question I've got is, how much battery life did you have in the gear?
Well, that was using a 35mm Aeroflex. I really can't remember exactly how much battery life we had, but that was certainly a factor, and how much film, because the film cassettes, had a limited time. That was for widescreen colour, of course. And it was quite an interesting episode, that for the reason that an experienced climber and I went in first, walking in to the Collinside Hut beside the Bona Glacier, and waited for the others to fly in by ski plane onto the Bona Glacier. No helicopters, of course. And we got stuck there for, I think, nearly 10 days in poor weather, right on the main divide. And eventually we started to run out of food and get a bit sick of each other's company.
Did you have tents, or were
we were in the Colin Todd hut,
right,
little mountain hut. And the day we decided to walk out, the others flew in by ski plane.
Okay.
And
wow.
So we had to turn around and walk back in. And then Bruce, if I mentioned Bruce Jenkinson, as I say, became a very good friend. And when I was asked to go filming for a national park film, wanting some wildlife, I was quite delighted that Bruce agreed to come with me and help me. And that was the sort of start of a new adventure.
So that was up the Landsborough, correct?
Yes, actually just over to the west of the Landsborough.
Yep.
So Bruce came up with the idea that a good place to go filming wildlife would be on the Solution Range between the Landsborough and the Clark Valley, and in that area, because he'd spent quite a lot of time on a survey job walking all through that area. We were pretty tight for money, so in those early days, but in this occasion, of course, the flying was paid for by the film unit, and we flew into Toy Toy Strip in the Landsborough with Tex Smith, who was a pretty well-known bush pilot from Queenstown, very well-known, and we carried our camera gear, pretty heavy, and tripods, telephoto lenses, up onto the top of the Solution Range, and spent about a week or 10 days camped up there and filming.
And you were filming animals?
Mainly red deer.
Okay.
Yes, the odd chamois.
Yeah.
And getting some footage there. Of course, the animals are pretty wary in New Zealand compared with a lot of other areas, so quite hard to get good wildlife film.
But this was in the mid-60s.
It was about 1965, 66 years.
Yeah, so sort of just before the whole venison industry really took off. So there must have still been quite a lot of animals in the area.
A lot of animals on the tops. And it was just before the first of the helicopter sorties.
Yeah.
And there was a wonderful area below us in the head of the Clark Valley called Mark's Flat. And golden tussock, little tarns, and a big mountain, Mount Hooker, straight above, and it was completely surrounded by mountains, and it's about 3,500 feet above sea level, and really, unless you were looking down on it, as we were, you'd hardly realise it was there. And when we were just sort of enjoying the scenery and relaxing after we'd been filming for a while, we started to sort of fantasize a bit, think, what a wonderful place to live or set up in. And really it just started off as daydreaming. And then I thought, well, Ros alone in Wellington, me had started to learn to fly at that point with the Wellington Aero Club. And
sorry, was Bruce daydreaming as well, or was it just you?
Yeah, no, Bruce was with me. That's where we would just really just a couple of young guys dreaming about a bit of a fantasy. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, this could actually be the nucleus of an idea where Ros and I could do something together, and I could try and develop my flying skills and have a hell of an adventure. And so we went back to Toy Toy and flew out with Tex again with our film. And I came back and said to Ros, I think I've got an idea here. And she didn't immediately discount it as crazy, as most people did.
So the idea was to go and live there and do what?
We were all a bit, that was sort of the idea, but we're a bit vague as to how it was going to work. And Bruce said he'd walked right across the flat, and he thought that there was one place, even though it looked very wet, that that would be suitable for an airstrip. Because while we were filming up on the tops, we didn't go down there. So we thought the first thing we need to do is actually establish that we could build an airstrip there, because we would need that sort of access. It was quite remote. And so I met up with Bruce down at Lake Ohau, and we walked in from Lake Ohau over the main divide through Broderick Pass to the Landsborough, over the top to Mark's Flat, and then scratched around and formed a very basic short airstrip, which I thought could be extended.
And at this time, you didn't have a pilot license.
I had a private license, I think, by then.
Right, but no backcountry bush flying experience, so you didn't really know what you're looking at.
Exactly. So, I had no false illusions of my own talents. I was obviously very green, and that was a big question about the whole exercise. But we figured that, particularly with Ros there, we would need to have an ability to get in and out by air, and also to pay costs by shooting deer and selling the venison. And so the next thing I did was to go and find a place where I could do a Cessna 180 rating, because I decided a Cessna 180 would be the best aeroplane for us. Up to 4 seats and quite a good payload, and able to operate off pretty short strips. And at that time, the only 180 in the country was at Hastings Bridge Power with the Hawke's Bay and East Coast Aero Club, I think. And a lovely guy called Herb Maxwell was the instructor there. And I went up and started a 180 rating, and bounced my way across Bridge Power a few times. Eventually got a 180 rating. And we walked in and out and proved that we could make an airstrip. And obviously the big question on my flying ability. So from then I started to really work on trying to develop some skills in the 180.
Was there anyone to teach you bush flying techniques?
No.
Because I think I read that you started a, what do you call it? A teach myself program.
Yeah, sort of. At the time, rural aviation was selling off a lot of 185s and 180s from top dressing at New Plymouth. And I went up to the old Bell Block aerodrome at New Plymouth, and Ros came with me, and we had a look at one of these aircraft, knowing very little about them. And to me, it was a pretty exciting aeroplane, and eventually bought an ex-top dresser, which were relatively inexpensive at that time. And then I started pounding the grass at Bell Block to try and master it a bit. And eventually flew down to Wellington. Didn't have a radio, so I had to come into Wellington Nordo, which was quite an experience.
How many hours would have you had total time?
About 60 or 70.
Right.
And then we moved south to Timaru, and my brother's wife's family had a little farm south of Timaru, and I went down there and started practicing in their paddocks, working down from the longer paddocks to the shorter ones, and started to get a bit more confidence in the 180. I see I did about 100 circuits at Bell Block, so I really pounded the circuit.
There was a story, you've started writing a book which you kindly let me have a read of, so I won't let on too much out of that. But there was a story in there of you having a go at landing on a friend's paddock, I think in the Wairarapa.
Was Macro, yes.
Yeah.
I bounced a few times.
Yeah, and found a row of trees at the end that you didn't know was there.
Yes. I think looking back on my flying, there've been a number of occasions where the correct automatic reaction in a very difficult situation is probably save my skin,
Mm.
and that was one of them.
Mm.
Yes, it was a very steep learning curve. It was really my first exposure to a one-way strip, fairly small, and I bounced a few times and very belatedly decided I better go around, and not a very easy go-around situation. So I really had to work hard on the psychological side, landing on one-way short strips,
Mm.
and very aware of my limitations, so taking it very cautiously.
Yeah. I mean, with no one to teach you this stuff, just
Yep.
learning and trying to stay alive, it must have been, I don't know, exciting, scary, so many emotions, all for this purpose of this crazy idea of going to live in Mark's flat with no business sort of goal behind it other than shooting a few deer. Was it
An adventure.
an adventure?
It was going to be an adventure that we could share together.
Mm.
We were very young.
Mm.
Ros would have been 22. I was 24.
Mm.
Yes.
What did your friends and family think of this crazy idea? Because you had a great job,
Yeah.
new wife, things were looking good, and you're now throwing it all away for an adventure.
Yeah, I think most people thought I was pretty crazy, and quite a number made no bones of the fact they wouldn't see me for very long. I had quite an interesting time with the old CAD, Civil Aviation Division of the Ministry of Transport, which was out at Kilburnie, I think.
Mm.
And Ian Ritchie was there working CAA, and Ian Ritchie, of course, had Ritchie Air Services out of Te Anau, and he was actually quite supportive when I went in to talk about the legal side of what we were doing, whether we could do this on a private pilot license.
Right.
And he didn't completely poo-poo the idea, and was actually very kind anyway, and quite supportive.
Well, I think you said the Civil Aviation Division considered you a somewhat temporary New Zealander.
I think a lot of people did.
Meaning you're not going to be around for long.
Yes. That had a pretty curious effect on me, really. It made me a bit nervous about what we were trying to do, but also quite determined to actually prove we could do it. It was a challenge, and a great challenge to meet. But anyway, eventually it got to the point where we thought it was time to go and try and fly into Mark's Flat. And the first West Coast airstrip landing I did was at Toi Toi in the Landsborough. And that was quite a momentous occasion for me too, coming from Wellington Airport to Toi Toi in the Landsborough. And Bruce, who was very, very good to me, if you like, in those days, looked after me pretty well. He insisted on walking over the top, which was no mean task, back over to Mark's Flat and checking the strip that it hadn't washed out or anything while we'd been away. And then eventually he went over to be on the ground while I tried to land there the first time.
At Toi Toi or Mark's Flat?
Back over at Mark's Flat.
Yeah.
Because we really had to establish that it could be done for our adventure to progress. So we had a few hold-ups with weather, but eventually the day came where he was over there waiting for me, and I flew over and plopped onto our short strip, which was very short.
How long?
Well, I vaguely remember it was only about 120 metres long.
Wow.
So
for a 100-hour pilot?
70 hours.
70 hours.
Yeah. But the excitement of actually being on the ground, actually being there at our aircraft on the ground was quite amazing. But then, of course, I could take in better implements, a wheelbarrow, grubbers and implements to finish the rest of the strip. And we eventually ended up with a reasonable length strip there. It was very undulating.
So talk through that first landing What were you feeling? Did you have several goes at it? Were you terrified, excited?
I think I was very determined that, Bruce had done a lot to get us to that point, walking backwards and forwards and helping me. And I think I was very determined that I had to get on the ground so we could actually start our adventure. And quite a lot of trepidation, but also quite a lot of determination to actually successfully get on the ground and stop there. It must have been fairly tense because it's the only time I've ever struck it. But when I'd landed, I couldn't unwrap my hand off the control column. I still see solid to the control column. But in the end, it was actually a bit of a non-event. She plopped on very nicely and skidded to a halt.
I guess you had been through it in your mind 100 times.
Yes.
The whole process.
Yep. And so we were able to start.
Yeah. And from there, you lengthened the strip using the wheelbarrows and shovels and whatever you'd brought in.
Yep.
And how long did you make it in the end?
I think it was about 350 metres.
Okay.
As I recall.
But still short enough for a strip at 3,500 feet, and presumably you're going to need to carry some loads off it.
Yes. Yep.
With tailwind at times, or
probably not too much tailwind, but it was a different world then. It sounds very short now, but it was very typical of what people were doing in those days.
But aeroplanes still used the same laws of physics.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Well, I learned a lot very quickly, and I was very cautious, very careful. But the next phase was to get Ros in there, and she was a city girl, so probably had little idea of what she was letting herself in for. But she was very excited when we first flew in. It is a magnificent little spot. And we set up. Bruce had to go back to his guiding job at Mount Cook fairly shortly. So then it was Ros and I on our own.
Had you both quit your jobs?
Ros had been working in a pharmacy in Miramar, and I'd left, and everybody wondered why the devil I was leaving, as you can imagine, what I was going to do. But it was a wonderful adventure. And, looking back, it's a bit like the short strips. Looking back, I shake my head sometimes thinking of leaving Ros on her own up there and going out with a load of deer, and her probably no way of getting out by herself. We didn't have radio on the ground or anything like that. But it was an experience that solidified our marriage for life.
It was either going to solidify it or break it, one of the two.
Exactly.
Luckily,
and she did marvellously well.
Yeah.
I know we built a very crude little hut up in the bushy edge, because you could in those days. And she did very well with meals and coming and helping me.
So what was a typical day or week like there?
Well, very much subject to the weather. We were actually up there during the Waihine storm. And for the first half of the night, we worried about the aeroplane blowing away, and the second half, we worried about our little hut blowing away, because it was a pretty wild night. And of course, we had no knowledge of what was happening up in Wellington Harbour at the time. So a typical day would be going out early for a shot.
Both of you, or just you?
Just me, usually. And Ros would cook up a nice breakfast when I got back. And one of the most idyllic times was sitting out in the Golden Tussock in the early morning sun, looking up at this big mountain above us and eating porridge or even bacon and eggs, because we ate quite well.
Was the cooking done on an open fire?
Just on an open fire, yes.
And if the weather was bad, how would you cook?
Well, the fire was half in the hut.
Right.
Yes. And then I had a very small Primus that I had left over from our climbing filming days that ran on avgas. So
You had plenty
I
of
used
that.
to use that a wee bit too. It was
Yeah.
just a tiny wee thing. But it between the time that Bruce and I went in and built the airstrip and then went back in with the aeroplane, there was quite a drastic change in the area. Um, and we didn't quite know what had happened because where there'd been lots and lots of deer all over the place, there were very few deer left in there.
Okay.
And then we found the odd strop and sign, and the first helicopters had gone through and pretty well decimated the herds of deer that were in there.
Right.
So there was still enough for me to shoot enough deer to pay for the running costs of the aircraft, but our days were numbered there. So we realised we had to move off and go somewhere else.
So you had originally anticipated this whole project, you might be in there for some years, or
No,
no?
it was never going to be long term. It was an adventure that we thought we might do for 2 years.
Right.
And that was partly dictated by in those days, the annual the 4-yearly certificate of airworthiness for the aircraft.
Yeah.
And it was quite a big overhaul required. And we knew that date was about 2 years off and would probably signal the end of our adventure. We didn't stay in there in the winter, but about that time, a chap called George Wyber had an Oster down at Lake Alabaster in the Pike River. And he was one of the very few down there that I knew of that had an aeroplane. And it was just after we'd started at Mark's Flat. Ros was still back in Timaru, actually, because we hadn't even got in there. And George was killed on the Harris Saddle on the Redburn track in his Oster with a load of deer. And fortunately, I'd just been talking to Ros on the phone the night before. So she was about the only person in New Zealand who didn't think it was me. But that left his block down on the Lower Pike available, and we were approached by the game packing company at Tianau as to whether we'd like to try and team up with the other chap that worked in the Pike, who had jet boat and horses. So we eventually went down and teamed up with Dale Hunter, who was a pretty well-known hunter down there.
Yeah.
And then spent a season nearly, summer season, with Dale and his fiancée in a little hut in the Upper Pike. And I was flying the deer out and hunting, and Dale had the jet boat and the horses. We had a pretty exciting time down there with the fjord and weather, and a river that flooded quite regularly.
Yeah, it gets wet down there, doesn't it? There's something about the Venison Recovery days with the aircraft and the helicopters that's, well, looking back now, it's almost sort of got a romantic it's probably not quite the right word, but a very nostalgic feel to it. And maybe because it was almost the Wild West, there weren't too many rules in place, it's never going to happen again. I don't know if it felt like that at the time.
It didn't so much. We really didn't have other people with aircraft at that time affecting us, but it certainly did when the helicopters came on the scene. And in fact, in the Pike, we arrived back in after a winter to find that we'd had helicopter people in there and shooting the tops and bringing the deer down onto the strip we operated off, and a huge pile of heads and legs and offal in it, and a pretty unpleasant scene for us, really. And we weren't very happy with the way they'd treated the place. And as it happened, the only place that didn't flood if the river came up was the middle of the airstrip. So I had dead men buried and tied the 180 down in the middle of the airstrip. And of course,
this was the Alabaster airstrip.
It was actually the Upper Pike,
the Upper Pike,
Wilmot,
yeah,
and in from Big Bay, and of course in those days they were using 180s mainly, and also a Beaver at one point. But in the Pike, they had 180s that were flying the deer out from the helicopters back out to Muscle Point actually, and they weren't very happy to find my aeroplane parked in the middle of the strip. And Dale and I were off hunting one day when a helicopter came in and landed by the two girls on the strip, and a fairly belligerent shooter covered in blood came in and quite threateningly told them that we better get that aeroplane off the strip in pretty uncertain terms. And Dale was probably a lot more fiery character than me, and we weren't very happy with that. So we told them that if they came in, then they said they were going to come in and buzz all the flats so that we wouldn't be able to go shooting in the early morning. So we retaliated by saying we'd go up and buzz all the tops. They couldn't shoot up there. And it turned into a bit of a standoff, which eventually ended up in a meeting on Big Bay. And we all ended up on the best of friends, as it turned out.
Okay.
They agreed not to buzz our tops and not to use our strip and leave offal and stuff around our strip. And we agreed not to chase around the tops.
Yeah. Did you have many close calls in that time? I mean, I'm sure it's a commercial operation. You need to make money, which means filling the plane up as much as possible. Did you have many scares? And how did you know your limits? You know, you hear so many stories of people filling the aircraft up with dozens of deer and lots of crashes.
Yes. You could say I was lucky. I was very careful. And I sort of worked within my limits pretty carefully. But, you know, it was seat of the edge of the seat stuff, because the strips weren't very long and you were carrying quite big loads. The Upper Pike particularly was challenging because the wind came in off Big Bay and sort of spread so that you never quite knew whether you were going to have a tailwind or a headwind. In fact, I had pretty crude windsock there. I had to watch very closely and eventually decide which way I was going to go with the load. I learned a bit of a lesson there. Because the Cessna 180 wing flaps tend to joggle in the tracks, I was rather inclined to lift them up if I was taxiing around for too long. And on one particular day with a load, I taxied backwards and forwards up the strip about 4 or 5 times, trying to wait for the wind to be in the right direction or not to be in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And eventually it looked right and away I went. And I got towards the end of the strip, which finished in the river, and she was very reluctant to fly. And I reached down to pull on some more flap, and whoops, there was none there at all. And I put the flaps down, to stop the joggling, and took off without any flaps, which was a disaster. But fortunately, I was able to pull them on in time to get airborne and miss going into the river. So that was probably a bit of a fright and a lesson. Line-up check.
Yeah.
But it was, a circumstance.
And you knew Tony Hawker at the time, didn't
Yes.
you? I've met his then wife, Marion, a couple of times. In fact, my wife and I had afternoon tea with her a month or so ago, which was really nice. But he was just a legend in those days, wasn't he?
Exactly.
Flying the Piper Cub.
Yep. we knew of Tony, and I'd occasionally see his Piper Cub in quite extraordinary places where I wouldn't have thought you could put a strip when I was flying backwards and forwards, because we used to go out to Muscle Point or down to Knobs Flat in the Eglinton with flying deer in and out. And I knew of Tony, and we did actually meet him briefly at Muscle Point, I think. But he certainly was legendary with where he went with his Piper Cub and his prowess. But we sort of came together when one day I had reason to land in the Arawata Valley in the middle of the riverbed, and there was a load of deer on the strip and some gear like pack and a rifle. And I think I must have come back a bit later and it was still there. And I thought, well, that's weird. Somebody's obviously expected to come back for this. And I went over and had a look at it. And it was a particular type of rifle, which I knew that I'd heard that Tony used. So I thought, oh no, this must be Tony's. So I took off and went round into the first side valley, which was the Waipara Valley, into the Arawata. And sure enough, round the corner, here was this Piper Cub perched in the scrub, having obviously not got airborne out of a little strip. And it was a very tight little spot. In fact, for me in the 180 to go down and have a look, there was no question of landing there, but I tried to fly past it very low to see if he was in the cockpit or any sign of him. But it appeared the cockpit was empty and no sign of him. So I assumed that he was walking out. He was a pretty resilient character. And so I went back to the strip, put his deer and his gear into the 180 and flew them out to Muscle Point to where I knew he worked with the helicopter guys there, and raised the alarm. And they flew in. And anyway, that brought a bit of a friendship with Tony. And we spent a bit of time with him. And he said, now I haven't got my aeroplane, he said, you better go and shoot my block in the head of the Arawata, which is an undreamed thing for us. But
yeah,
it's great.
Yeah, the stories, well, there's so many stories about him, but the stories of, what he could carry on his back.
Oh, yes.
What he could fit in his aeroplane, and then him and Marion, bringing their kids up in the bush. Just amazing stories.
He was a very modest character, Tony, and of course I didn't know him terribly well, but we did go and spend at least one night with him at his hut at Copper Creek, north of Haast, and we were very impressed with the very civilised setup he had. And he took me out, I went out with him for an evening shot, and I'd heard of his prowess, but he actually shot a couple of deer I couldn't even see in the dark. And he said very disparagingly to himself, I think I might have quite good night vision. And I agreed. Yeah. But, and also, as you commented, I've never done anything with a Piper Cub, but it was just staggering the amount of deer they were putting into their Piper Cubs.
Just to go back to the whole risk of leaving your job and moving into Mark's Flat, there was a beautiful paragraph you wrote, which I just want to read out, of really just saying how you felt about it. On the one hand, I felt a growing fear of what we were planning, a fear of hurting others and a fear of the thought of suddenly and violently leaving Ros, a young widow, alone in the wilds. On the other hand, I felt a growing determination to prove them wrong, to show them that it could be done. We were making a determined attempt to break free from the bonds of convention and do something different. The old maxim was foremost in my mind: better to have tried and failed than to never have tried at all. And I think so many of us, even these days, have those same feelings. We might feel a little bit stuck in our humdrum life and we want to do something different, but there's so many reasons why we shouldn't leave or shouldn't try something different, and you actually went out and did it.
Yes. Yep.
Did you consider yourself a risk taker back then? Did you see it as a huge risk, or you would sort of weighed it all up?
I knew there were risks, but I was quite determined to show that it could be done, and of course it was an adventure, real adventure, and there was an end in sight, so to speak, and that is having time with Ros rather than being away all the time, and developing flying schools, and eventually going on towards commercial flying, and just a hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah. So the Venison time lasted a couple of years, I think, roughly.
Really did it for 2 summers, really.
Yep.
Yes.
And then your C of A came due on the airplane, which you went and did. And then from there, you formed a new venture with the airplane, which sort of spawned the whole Air Safaris idea.
Yeah, so we came back from our West Coast adventure, if you like, with an aeroplane and a bit more experience than I'd started with. And we moved into Timaru, and I suppose once the C of A was finished on the 180, it was, what could we do with it next? And there was a chap called Arthur Rudge, a great chap who was top dressing out of Timaru, and he actually said to me, there's possibly an opening at Lake Tekapo for scenic flights. And in those days was the old Air Services licensing system and licensed airstrips, and the only airstrip at Lake Tekapo, a very dusty grass strip, was actually licensed to Mount Cook Company. And so they weren't going to probably welcome somebody coming up and doing scenic flights off their strip. By this time I'd got a commercial license, and so Ros and I walked around this area here of Lake Tekapo looking at possible sites away from the strip, and eventually gave that up. And we got together then with Laurie and Malcolm Prouting at Mesopotamia, and Graham Murray, who was in the travel industry, and sort of started to dream up the idea of this company taking out hunters and fishermen, and it really just sort of came together rather ad hoc.
Were they involved from the high country sheep station sort of aspect, Malcolm and Laurie?
Well, they had Mesopotamia. Laurie, they already had aircraft. They had 2 Osters, one being used for top dressing. And I don't think there was any real clear picture of how we were going to do it, but we all ended up down at Ashburton at the Prouting's accountants. And it was almost who wants to be in this? And,
and what are we going to do?
Formed this company, Air Safaris.
Right.
And Ros and I would be the pilot guide.
Yeah.
And we moved our family to Mesopotamia.
Okay.
That started a wonderful 3 years. Great people. And Mrs. Prouting Senior, Thelma, was a great mother for Ros, great surrogate mother for Ros with 2 little children. And we had a pretty exciting time at Mesopotamia.
So you were taking hunters and fishermen into the backcountry. And did you have to build airstrips, or where did you land them?
There were already some basic airstrips there, but there was work to enlarge them, and Laurie was very good with a bulldozer, and It was pretty interesting trying to build airstrips in fairly remote areas, one of which was pretty high up. Eventually became known as the Royal Strip because Prince Charles and Princess Anne went in there for a backcountry cup of tea. And
did you take them in?
No, they flew in by several helicopters.
Right, yeah.
But I flew in with Malcolm Prouting to be on the ground and meet them there.
Okay.
So
I suppose you'll be going to the coronation shortly?
Yes. That was, pretty interesting time. And with the aircraft, the local deerstalkers used to drive up and down the Havelock Valley in an old quad they had, and it was a very rough, jarry trip. So I started shuttling deerstalkers backwards and forwards up the valley in the 180, trying to drum up business around the place for scenic flying. Because along the way, of course, in those days we had to get an air service license. It was in those days.
To do commercial work.
Yeah. So we went through that and got a charter license and started to use the 180 for scenic flying.
So how did you drum up business?
Well, in various ways. We got the odd person who turned up at Mesopotamia, and I started the Grand Traverse flight, which we still use as our name.
Wow.
Which was a very good circuit around the Hauraki Mount Cook area, Franz, Josef, Fox, Tasman, back. And a number of times in our business, we've had to go to the people rather than get the people to come to us. So I used to take the 180 down to Peel Forest, the bottom of the Rangitata Gorge, and used a paddock there. And I would go around the motor camp, literally tapping on people's tents, talking them into joyrides.
Really?
Yeah. So that's how we started.
And you got a bit of business out of that?
A bit of business doing joyrides,
wow.
The odd long flight round into the Alps, and places like Lake Clearwater, Lake Camp had strips. Yeah. So that was the very start of the flying business.
Yeah. Slightly different subject, but I think about this time, you needed to have your instruments checked a lot more often in those days. And I was talking to Reg Taylor last week, who I'm sure you'll remember, and he said he remembers you coming up to a marker to have your instruments checked, and to save some money, you'd take them out yourself, you'd sleep the night in the airplane, and then they'd do the instruments, and then you'd fit them all back in and come back home.
Yes, those were the days, weren't they?
Yeah. Can't do that anymore.
No. And fortunately, we don't have to do that every year either.
No. So, when did you move to Tekapo?
Well, we started the business at Mesopotamia there in 69, 70, early part of 70, late 69, and had a wonderful 3 years there. But a number of things. For a start, operating the aircraft, we needed more flying. And also, it was a period when high country sheep stations involved in tourism was a bit controversial. And
for what reason?
I think probably there was quite a lot of jealousy, if you like, on the part of hunters, that high country stations were taking out overseas hunters. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But also on pastoral leases, partly. So it was a wee bit controversial, and we probably saw that we needed to distance ourselves a bit from Mesopotamia.
Right.
After a wonderful 3 years there. A great family, the Proutings. And I'd already started flying over to Tekapo and doing flights out of the little strip at Tekapo.
That was operated by Mount Cook?
No, ironically, they relinquished the license on the strip, and so that opened the way for me.
Right.
And I know a number of the pilots at the time at Mount Cook were quite disappointed that it happened, because we became a thorn in their side, of course, doing scenics, and got a lot of support from the local youth hostel, motor camp, and the then single motels really here, far cry from now,
Yeah.
in terms of the amount of accommodation, but quite a lot of support and encouragement to provide scenics. And so I'd already been coming across and doing those. And in 1973, we decided to separate from Mesopotamia, and Laurie and Malcolm Prouting withdrew from the company.
Right.
And left Graham and I on our own. And Ros and I moved with our family to Timaru, to Lake Tekapo.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And so you carried on the same type of operation, scenics, hunters, fishermen, but based out of Tekapo?
Yeah. It was much more to the scenic flying.
Right. So I guess that was really the start of where you are now, and
Exactly.
in a very small way.
Yep, exactly.
With the 180 still?
Still with the 180. Oh, no, sorry. In 1973, we bought a brand new Cessna 185.
Brand new.
Brand new.
So you'd obviously be making a little bit of money.
Well, it was a bit ironic, actually, how that came about, but it was one of those things that it worked out in the end. But we thought that we had a bit of a benefactor who was going to provide quite a lot of money to buy this new aircraft, and turned out that he was actually a con man. And it fell through a bit.
Right.
And but we still managed to handle buying it, trade it, sold the 180.
Okay. What was the registration? So the 180 was Bravo Delta Echo, and the 185?
Delta Juliet Mike, DJM.
Right.
Delta Juliet Mike.
Yep.
So we moved into the new 185 and then did the flying out of Tekapo. It was probably about then that I learned a pretty valuable lesson about aviation. But it was quite a heady time, because we were getting quite busy with the scenic flights, and I just packed up for the day, and we built a windbreak and parked the 185 behind the windbreak on this pretty windswept flat that we're on, and I just put it away because it was getting quite windy in the Mount Cook area, and a local retired doctor who had a house in Tekapo called me up and said, I've got my son and his family out from England, and they're very keen to go flying. And I said, I've just put the 185 away. It's getting pretty bumpy out there. I don't think they'd enjoy it. He said, I don't think they'd mind it. They're really keen to go. So I said, okay. So they came out. They were a delightful little family, and the son sat up the front with me, and was very interested in the aircraft. And I pointed out to him how the altimeter worked and the airspeed indicator, and we did the flight. They enjoyed it. It was a bit bumpy. We got back, and he helped me push the 185 back into the windbreak, and I showed him how the elevators worked and the ailerons. And about that stage, he said something that made me stop and think of it. I said, do you fly yourself? He said, just a little bit. I said, what, big aircraft, small aircraft? He said, just little ones. I said, what, with an aircraft? No, actually, I'm with the RAF. He was the leader of the Red Arrows.
Oh.
So a very early lesson for me that often those that say the least have done the most.
Yeah. I'm sure you impressed him.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
When did you move on to the current location where you now have the airport and the runway?
The strip the grass strip was not really very suitable. It was in the wrong direction for a start. It was very rough and got very dusty in the summer and mud in the winter. And we were very fortunate that the Hunter Western family that owned Mount John Station allowed me to use it for a start, and then allowed me to at least consider putting a different runway or a different strip in. And in those days we had to deal with the Lands and Survey, and by quite a lot of negotiation. And I think I learned in those days too that dealing with government departments, it often worked quite well to start off by saying, I don't think you're going to be able to help me, but this is what I'd like to do.
Okay.
And we did get,
reverse psychology.
Well, people tended to be more helpful when you started off like that. And we did get approval to build a strip, and we got one of the very early recreational permits from the Lands and Survey, which allowed us to operate coincidental with the pastoral lease. And the place was so exposed that we really had to get a hangar up.
Yeah.
And we had a very good friend called Peter Foote who developed the Mount Dobson ski field, and he had a lot of heavy machinery, and he came down with an old drag scraper, bulldozer, and it formed the first part of the runway. And fairly difficult terrain because it's all old glacial outwash plain, big rocks, and fairly uneven. And he also was a pretty accomplished welder and so on, and helped us with our first hangar. And our first pilot, who also helped a lot with in those early days with the building, was Ron Small, who made a bit of a name for himself later in life, lifting the guys off the top of Mount Cook who got stranded up there.
Yeah, I know Ron from Marlborough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Ron was great. And he and I got in, and we started building this hangar with Peter Foote's help welding. And of course, we had to get approval from the Lands and Survey all the way through as to what we were doing around lands. And the commissioner was a fairly stern, almost forbidding person called George Mollett. And he used to occasionally come in to see what we were up to. And I think we were a bit beyond what they'd really envisaged we might be doing. And he said, well, if you're going to build a hangar, I think you need to build a mound to disguise it slightly from the main highway. So with the old TD-18 bulldozer, I think it was, we formed quite a big mound, partially obscuring the hangar from the main highway.
Which is still there.
Which is still here.
Yeah.
And it very quickly became known as Mollett's Mountain.
Okay.
And our two older children were still running around preschool, and they used to come out quite often to help us at the airport with me, or play out there while we were working out there. And one day, George Mollett, the commissioner, I think he was, came in to see what we were up to, and I was very much, yes, Mr. Mollett, no, Mr. Mollett, we're doing this, Mr. Mollett, being very polite. And one of the kids said, Dad, shh, I'm talking to Mr. Mollett. But Dad, no, shh, I'm busy talking to Mr. Mollett. But Dad, could we go and play on Mollett's Mountain?
Did he look at you sideways? So that must have been a pretty exciting time, because now the business is really going from an idea, an adventure. Now you've actually got some infrastructure and your own hangar and a runway, and it's becoming something quite serious now.
Yes, it was. Again, of course, it was a bit in the same ilk as the Mark's Flat adventure, trying to prove it was possible and make it work. So it was quite heady times.
So what was the next big step in the business? Was it a new aircraft type?
The business started to grow quite quickly. And we got our first new 206 in 1975.
New again?
Brand new. DWX. And we were getting a little bit of support from a particular coach tour that was based in Adelaide. And the New Zealand manager had been quite supportive. And in those days, the ski planes were really, really busy. In fact, probably couldn't handle the number of passengers they had.
The Mount Cook ski planes. Yep.
Of course, in those days, the airline was operating in and out of Mount Cook with the 748s. And this particular tour company had trouble getting their people flights at Mount Cook. And the New Zealand manager approached us and said, would we like to commit to flying all their passengers? And that was quite a big moment for us. It was a move into the tour market.
Yeah.
And we were starting to get the odd tour passengers, but very much with limited capacity, we started to have to into aerodrome hop between aerodromes while the coach moved through the area. In those early days, a lot of the coach tours were overnighting at Lake Tekapo, so we would get the afternoon, the early morning, and we got really good support from camping tours, staying out at the motor camp. And I can remember one occasion where, still with just the 185, we flew an entire camping tour between the afternoon and late afternoon and early morning.
Was it just
40 odd people?
Just you as the only pilot at this point? Did you have other pilots?
I mentioned Arthur Rudge before, who was the top dressing pilot down at Timmering. Arthur came up and helped me with his wife doing in the first summer, and we would take turns. One would start early, finish at midday,
right,
and the other do the afternoon through to quite late. And we were doing pretty high hours in the 185 and getting through these coach tours. With the tour company that I mentioned, called Kura Tours, we started picking them up at Fairley. There was a strip that we could use at Fairley, flew them through to Tekapo via the Aoraki Mount Cook area, and then would go on further south. It was all a bit political in those days with the aerodromes. Mount Cook company were not very welcoming to people to use Mount Cook Airport, which they had. And we used to use Birch Hill, which was the grass strip quite close to Mount Cook Airport there. Sort of blossomed from there, if you like. We got a second U206 DXZ. So we now had a 185 and two 206s and more pilots. And I guess the next big step was moving into the first turbine machine. I couldn't see much future in getting more and more 5-passenger aircraft. So we needed to get into something larger capacity. And a good friend was working up in New Caledonia and contacted me about a Pilatus Porter that was going to be coming available up there. And we went up and eventually bought this Pilatus Porter. I started with the Porter with great trepidation, our first turbine.
Yep.
And I'd heard all these horror stories about hot starts, cooked it mainly in Hughes 500s actually in those days. And I well remember the first scenic flight I did in the Porter. I was still pretty nervous about stuffing up the starts, and I was concentrating on the first start with a group of Australians, and I was just about to put the fuel in, and I heard someone down the back say, "You got the camera focused, Bert?" And Bert was sitting beside me, pointing his camera at me, and he said, "Yeah, I've got it focused on the hair sticking out of his nose." So a few distractions. But the Porter was great. Wonderful pilot's aeroplane.
How many Porters did you have?
Just one.
Just one?
Just the one. Yep. And it sort of opened up new things for us a bit too. I guess it put us on the map a wee bit, the Porter. It was a pretty impressive looking aeroplane. And our lawyer came up to look at it. He said, "Well, Richard," he said, "you do pick on ugly aeroplanes."
Oh, it's not ugly. Beautiful.
And I remember taxiing out from maintenance down at Dunedin Airport one day, and Mount Cook 748 was holding for me to taxi in, and the tower said, "Just hold for the ugly duckling taxiing in." And the pilot of the 748 said, "I wouldn't mind if it had our colours on it."
So what, you put skis on the Porter
We'd
at some
already
point?
put skis on the 185.
Right.
So that was a bit of a story too, because in those days the Tekapo ski field, or Round Hill ski field, had very large numbers of skiers up there in the wintertime. And our frustration was that our winters were very quiet, and the skiers would have these pristine winter mornings or winter days, and the skiers would only want to go skiing when the weather was good, and they'd only want to come for a flight when the weather was no good for skiing.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, if they won't come to us, maybe we need to go to them. So Carl Birch, senior, who was owned the ski field, was very delighted to help by letting us, he would groom a strip for me up pretty close to the base of the chairlift.
Okay.
And we got skis for the 185. And again, it was a bit of a self-teach on that. But the skis just opened up so many new possibilities for us. And I started flying up to the ski field with shuttling people from Tekapo and then doing scenic flights.
So you would actually take people to go skiing. They'd have their day and you'd bring them
fly
back.
back,
Yeah.
and then sell a few scenics. You know, we were scraping for extra work. And I also had a dabble at ski touring, where we could land on the faces further north of the ski area and drop skiers off. We had a run that was about 8 kilometres long that they could do with mixed success. But I loved the ski planing and just the ability to land almost anywhere in the wintertime up there. But eventually we put skis on the Porter,
Okay.
which was just a marvellous ski plane.
I bet.
It was just so much fun.
Yeah.
Because it was so good.
Yeah. Then, I mean, this is just a story of different aircraft types and opportunities. 1982, I think, was when you introduced the Nomad or thereabouts.
Yes.
What was the thought behind bringing in now a much larger aeroplane, multi-engine, different type of engine again?
Yes, interesting. When the first Nomad was demonstrated in New Zealand, it was an N22, the shorter version. It was a much respected airworthiness. It was an aircraft surveyor in those days at Christchurch, Vince Carter. Lovely man. And I said to Vince, that would be an aeroplane that would be ideal for us. And he said, "Oh no, Richard," he said, "that's far too much of an aeroplane for you. You'll never have one of those."
And that was it. Your eyes saw red.
Challenge. Yeah. And we started off buying an ex-demonstrator from, it was government aircraft factories then, I think, still, built by the Australian government, of course.
So the idea of this was for a scenic flight machine.
Yes. Again, larger capacity. The other thing, of course, was that there was a change coming in the rules too, that CAA were going to require a guaranteed safe landing in the event of an engine failure. And that caught a lot of us on a bit on the hop, that how do you do that in a single engine aeroplane?
Especially in the terrain you operate
Exactly. And that was part of the motivation for going to the twin engine machine. And some of the helicopter operators, of course, went to twin engine squirrels for the same reason. But it did pose major issues for some of the other operators, notably the ones going into Milford. How do we comply with that? And so in the end, that was sort of backed off on. But by that time, we'd already committed to going into twin engine Nomads. Bigger capacity, also very quiet over the Aoraki Mount Cook National Park, which was quite a thing for us. It's trying to minimise the effect of aircraft noise. And we were starting to, Graham, who was still with me then, had done a great job of winding up business with Japanese groups. And we were starting to get quite big numbers of Japanese coach tours. So we started to need bigger capacity. It was about that time that we found that a lot of our Japanese customers, in fact, the bulk of them, couldn't speak any English whatsoever. So I figured somebody in the camp had to be able to speak a bit of Japanese. So I bought, in the old days, a linguaphone course, which was a series of tapes and instructional Japanese English dictionaries. And I used to lie in the bath at night practicing my Japanese so that I could actually at least converse to a certain extent. And it was about that time that I think Graham in the town office called out to the airport and said, "I'm sending out a very nice Japanese couple." So, well, great, I'll try out my Japanese on them. So I saw them come into the car park, and I bounced down my stairs and met them at the door with my very best. "Ohayou gozaimasu. Keiso wa ii tenki desu ne?" The guy recalled slightly, he said, "We come from Palmerston North, mate."
Put your foot in it a little bit.
So that led to some pretty interesting times with the Nomads. They were a much maligned aircraft in many ways and absolutely perfect for our operation. Everybody had their own window, high wing, and as I say, very quiet around the Cook area. The 22 was fairly limited, so we very quickly started to try and find N24s. And by that time, they'd stopped manufacturing them, and we couldn't really afford to buy new ones. So started to source N24s from all around the world. And the furthest afield was New Bedford in Massachusetts, which we actually dismantled over there. And a lot of people will know Bob Jelly. Bob came over with Ros and I and supervised getting the Canadian company there to dismantle them and ship them back to New Zealand.
Right.
Which in itself was an adventure. But the rest of them we ferried out to New Zealand. And probably the
Yourself?
With help.
Yeah.
Probably the most challenging one was we bought 2 Nomads from Polynesian Airlines in Samoa. And my great friend Keith Mitchell and Tom Middleton came over with me, and we flew the 2 back to New Zealand. And because of the logistics of trying to take ferry tanks over to Samoa for the 2 aircraft, we decided that we could do it on standard tanks by island hopping. CAA put a fairly rigid provisions for the longer hop, but we had to bounce from Samoa to Wallis Island, a French possession, to Nandi, across to Vanuatu, Port Vila, down to New Caledonia, to Norfolk Island and home. So it was a long way around.
Yeah.
And we eventually, after a few little setbacks at the start, had them ready, and we flew them round to New Zealand. And one of the provisos that Civil Aviation set on us was that for the long hop from Nandi to Port Vila in Vanuatu, we had to have perfect weather and be in line of sight of each other, because only one of them had, it was before the days of sat-nav, of GPS, one of them had a Omega navigation system, the N24, and we had to have that operating and be in line of sight for the crossing of that stretch. And it had to be perfect weather. And when we got to Nandi, a Cyclone Uma, was actually building north of Vanuatu. And I was pretty depressed. I said, well, we can't go with that. And Tom Middleton, who was going to fly the N22 for me, had a great saying. I think we should just do what's sensible, Richie, he would say. I think we'll do what's sensible. He said, the cyclone's giving us a really good tailwind, which it was, on this longer stretch. And it's not due to hit Vanuatu till the day after we get there. So we agonised over it, and then thought, right, well, we'll go and we'll make a decision at halfway. And things fell into place, because Vanuatu had a bit of a reputation for clouding up during the day. And we were lucky. We got a very helpful Australian guy on the radio at the Vanuatu end, who knew exactly what we were looking for, gave us really good information on the weather, and we continued and got there safely, got fueled, and got out of there as quick as we possibly could. And the Cyclone Uma, of course, devastated the place the next morning.
Wow.
So we were just ahead of it.
So how many Nomads did you operate over the years?
We eventually operated about 8 Nomads, and at any one time, 6 maximum.
Yeah.
And for us, they were a very good aeroplane for us, much better than their reputation.
Yeah. Just to take a little tangent, you mentioned a few times Civil Aviation wouldn't allow us to do this and so forth. What was it like dealing with the Civil Aviation division back in those days in the 60s and 70s compared to what it is now? You know, I mean, they're still very bureaucratic, but maybe more so back then. I'm not sure. Were they user-friendly, practical compared to what they are now?
We've always enjoyed a pretty good relationship with CAA. You know, obviously, we've been through a lot of auditing over the years, and some auditors have been have earned a lot of respect and have had a very positive effect. And of course, we've had the odd very nitpicky auditor who has had the opposite effect. I often talk about Brian Dunn. You might remember the picture of Aviation Safety Needs You, Brian. Wonderful man. In his mid-80s, or early 80s possibly, he came down and I think helped us through a re-entry audit. And he would leave his home, I think about 4:30 in the morning to get down here. And he loved to come down early enough to see us going about our sort of early morning tasks, like doing the weather for Niwa, getting the terminal ready. And he would just sit quietly there watching. And when he said something to us, we really took notice,
mm.
and he had great respect. So he was one person that I remember well.
And, you know, I'm sure you agree, but in my experience, it's exactly the same now. You know, there's individuals that are extremely helpful and knowledgeable, people like Chris Nichols and, you know, Steve Shaw over the years on the maintenance side has been great. So I'm sure that's not going to change. You know, there's individuals whose heart is really want to do the right thing and help out people in the industry, isn't there?
I think it's a pretty pivotal job because it can have two different effects on operators, and particularly if somebody's. I know we had a period where we'd put a huge amount of effort into safety and systems and so on, and another person who became a great friend, Jeff Ensor, was our chief pilot then, and he'd put a huge amount of effort into systems, but we had a particular auditor who was very destructive, and it had a very detrimental effect. So the auditor is quite pivotal, and I mean, sure, if you're doing something deliberately wrong, you need to be stamped on. But if people are really trying hard and maybe have got something not quite right, I think encouragement is a lot more important than sitting on them.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if it's worse today, but I know a lot of people that have actually got out of aviation because they just can't be bothered putting up with exactly that sort of thing that you were talking about.
Yep. I've seen that happen.
Yeah, which is such a shame because there's a lot of great people, there's a lot of great experience, and to lose them just due to someone's opinion of a rule or interpretation or attitude, which was not the best, is just such a shame for everybody, isn't it?
Yep. Yes, I've seen that over the years. Very good people who've given up in frustration almost.
Yeah. You ended up doing some IFR work and some Mount Cook and in New Zealand overcapacity work, which seems to me, well, I guess it's a natural progression for an aircraft like that, but it seems to me to be quite a sort of a tangent from what your whole business had been up to then.
The challenge we've always had for VFR charter flying is the difference between here in the high country and the Canterbury Plains, as we get so much of that low easterly rubbish on the plains, and very difficult to safely and legally fly backwards and forwards. So I learned very early on to be quite open with people on charters that this may not go due weather.
Yep.
If you don't do that, of course, it puts a lot of pressure on pilots and the operation with disappointed people. So it was a bit like trying to learn Japanese. I thought if we're going to be successfully doing this, we have to get an IFR operation going. And I started off in a 207 that we'd had, a brand new 207 we'd bought that was set up for IFR, and I set to get my instrument rating, single pilot, and eventually multi single pilot instrument rating. So that opened up a lot more reliable charter work for us.
Yeah.
And I was quite lucky that we had Tom Middleton, who was a pretty experienced IFR pilot, and Jeff Ensor, who'd flown with Eagle, and they came in with me, and we operated the Nomad's IFR for 10 or 12 years. Did a lot of early work for Air Nelson. And Mount Cook Airlines in those days had major overhauls on their 748s that took them out of operation for a month or so, and we started doing what were called overcapacity flights between Queenstown, Mount Cook Airport, and Tekapo. And Christchurch. We had a very good relationship with Mount Cook Company. In the early days, they were very protective. Mount Cook Airport, not the ski plains. And we were probably one of the very few operators that they allowed, even right back into our earliest days with our hunters, to fly in and out of Mount Cook Airport to join airline services. And we started to do these flights for them. Queenstown, Mount Cook, Christchurch.
And was the Nomad well suited to that? I can imagine it might pick up ice a wee bit and be a bit slow, or did it work all right?
We couldn't fly the high routes IFR, so we needed good weather. But they did surprisingly well. Quite often we had 2 Nomads operate our service on a single day. And it was a pretty heady time for us too.
I bet. Yeah.
A great company and great people. The ground staff were just amazing and never put pressure on us. Looked after us very well, and we did our very best for them.
Was that whole scheduled service a distraction or a tangent in where you wanted to be as a company, or did you not really have a certain goal where the company direction wanted to go? Just wherever, whatever doors opened and opportunities came up, you were happy to go with?
Some of it we were approached to see if we would help. But of course, one of our real challenges over the years has always been utilisation, being so weather dependent.
Yeah.
The whole operation has always been characterised by very low aircraft utilisation due weather. So the IFR gave us quite a steady number of hours. It wasn't a very high earner. In fact, our accountants reckon we should stop it.
Right.
But it had the other big benefit of keeping 3 of us quite current IFR for our other work. I think it raised a few eyebrows too, that particularly when we were doing a regular service for Air Nelson and latterly Air New Zealand Link between Timaru and Christchurch. It was an ideal little sector for a Nomad, quite low MSAs, short, and the reliability, I think, surprised people, how reliable the Nomads were, shuttling backwards and forwards.
All right, we've just had a wee break. Bit of a wild, stormy day out there, so it's very exciting with the thunder. One thing we didn't mention was your Franz Josef operation.
Yes.
So do you want to just briefly tell us about how that got underway and what you do there? And I think you had a wee bit of drama there with some flooding and...
Yes, we've had a few setbacks over the years, that's for sure. Well, Franz Josef always was an interesting place for us. In fact, in the very early days, the very first days at Tekapo, I used to sell a flight called A Flight to Another World over to Franz Josef. And there was quite a history of washed out airfields over there, and various entities put in runways, including a sealed runway, quite close to the township, but quite regularly washed out. And a chap called Kevin Burns, locally known as Long Drop, started a little operation called West Air. And he had a Cessna Cardinal and 177 and a 206. And he had bought a property about 6 or 7 kilometres away from the township, but still threatened by the river. And it was called Milton's. And he came over one day to Tekapo and, for better or for worse, convinced me that we should buy his little operation and his aeroplanes,
right,
which we did. And of course, he'd had different pilots flying for him over there, and we were lucky to have a very good chap took over for us as a manager there for us, and he was quite forward thinking, and we built a very nice little terminal, sealed runway, and our resident pilot Tony Howard, based at Franz, looks after the base very well. The river has always been a worry there, and we took a gamble in developing the airfield or the aerodrome with a sealed runway there, knowing that it had been washed out in the past, but we were hoping that the big stop bank that had been put in would protect us. And it was about 30 to 35 years since the previous flood. So we figured that's quite enough to make a bit of a business. And then, of course, goodness, 3 or 4 years ago, we had the big flood, and most people will remember the pictures of the Franz Josef bridge being swept away that was shown on television, and that came right through our aerodrome.
Right. So how much did you lose of the runway?
A farmer down the road called up Tony and said, would we like our runway back, because it was lying on his paddock.
Wow.
Down the road. We lost about half of the sealed runway. Fortunately, the terminal we'd built, a nice little terminal, built it up on piles, so it was above water. The aeroplane we had there, an Airvan, did get quite badly swamped.
So have you rebuilt the runway?
We put it back into compacted shingle in the meantime.
Yeah.
We'll wait and see how effective the new stop bank is. Yep.
Yeah. One other event, which I'm sure you probably don't like discussing much, but if we could, was your Cardinal accident in 1998.
Yep.
No one wants to have an accident, especially such a well-respected and safe operation as yours. So do you want to just talk us through what happened there and what were the outcomes?
Yes, well, that obviously was a terrible event for us. I mentioned earlier that we put a huge amount of effort into safety systems, procedures, very dedicated chief pilot, Jeff Ensor, and a pretty dedicated team. And it was an accident that hit us from the side. You know, we knew there were areas where, despite our best efforts, we might have an accident. Engine failure after takeoff, that sort of thing. But we didn't envisage an accident like this one. And, you know, I guess I'd rather fondly hoped I'd get through my flying career with the business and never have a serious accident. I was actually up in Wellington negotiating with the New Zealand Defence Force over the land that the runway's on when I got a call from Sandra in our terminal there to say that one of our aircraft was missing. And it was pretty shattering. We knew exactly where it was, but we couldn't get to it because of the weather. And there were 2 Japanese ladies with the pilot, the 177.
So it had crashed on high up on a mountain?
Yes. It was a bit of a mystery. Bjorn, the pilot, had already done a flight out of Glentana in a 207, and then there was a large Japanese group to fly out of Tekapo, and he switched to the Cessna Cardinal because we were about 2 over the top of the number that they had, and he was going to take the 2 in the Cardinal, and there were 3 Nomads and a 207 going up at the same time, and the Cardinal followed along, and the 2 ladies were taking almost continuous video by one and photographs by the other. So we had a very good photographic record from the cameras recovered eventually of the progress of the flight, which was perfectly normal. But the mystery was that the aircraft went from a perfectly normal position to the crash site at a period where the most dramatic scenery was below them, and the video and camera, video and still stopped at that point. So there was 5 minutes of no filming after constant filming all the way, which immediately, of course, prompted us to thinking that something might have been going on that was distracting them. The pilot gave no indication of an issue.
It was a nice day.
It was clear on the eastern side, with clouds starting to form, quite a thin layer on the western side, and a strong northerly but smooth flying conditions at altitude. So, obviously a huge amount of soul searching, and also all the trauma of trying to work with the Japanese families. And in the end, there was no real official finding. The company came out of the investigation surprisingly well, actually. But there was no real official finding as to the cause.
Which in itself, I mean, on the one hand, I guess it's nice to know that there was nothing found, there were no gaps in your safety procedures and whatnot. But on the other hand, having no idea why this happened must be quite unsettling.
It was. We obviously agonised, still agonise over what might have been going on that caused the two Japanese ladies not to be filming when they'd been filming constantly, and not enough for the pilot to actually advise the others, because they were all up there together talking. And, we thought about doors that it might have come open, but it would have to be something that wasn't serious enough for the pilot to report to the other guys, but enough to distract him. And in the process, he lost quite a lot of height, and he ended up in the thin bit of cloud coming over the main divide. So, I thought about things like a bumblebee in the cockpit, which would have upset the Japanese ladies. I've even had a bird come to life in the cockpit on a flight. So we've thought about all those sorts of things, but really couldn't come up with anything.
Engine failure an option?
No evidence.
He would have called that, wouldn't he?
Yeah, no evidence of any malfunction of any sort. So it was a pretty terrible time.
Have you had any contact with the families after that?
Yes. So we were very lucky that the South Island manager of the Japanese company that had arranged their tour was a lovely lady called Shoko McFarlane. And she came with me over to Japan to see the families.
Okay.
Went over and talked to them both. That was a pretty interesting experience in itself. One of the husbands was very philosophical. He through an interpreter, of course, said she wanted to do it, she enjoyed it, it happened, that's fate. He was actually a very ill man anyway himself. The other husband was an older doctor, and again a very stern and forbidding sort of character, and he was not buying the no reason.
Right.
He could not understand that there wasn't a reason for the accident, that somebody wasn't to blame. And he'd built a little shrine for his wife, which I had to go and show respect to, but I was making no headway with him. The women were all from some sort of local body group, and the officials were having a pretty hard time with the old doctor as to why his wife had been killed when the others had got on the bigger aircraft. They had it in their mind that they died because they were in a small aircraft. And he, as I say, we sat round his living room, and I was really making no headway. I tried to explain to him as best I could through the interpreter that we knew something funny must have happened, but we didn't know what. And there was no official reason given for the crash. And then he produced some photos, and he'd blown up all his wife's photos onto 10 inch by 8 inch enlargements, and he started putting them out, showing me. And he produced one from down when they'd stopped by the church at Tekapo that obviously wasn't the day of the accident, because I could see from the weather in the background it was a different day. And I said, "Oh, that's not the same day of the accident." And he was quite upset. He said, "Yes, my wife's photo. Yep, same day." And I thought, well, do I let it pass at that, or do I stick with it? I said, "No, it's a different day. That is not the same day." And we had a bit of an impasse for probably half a minute while he was insisting it was the same day, and I was trying to explain that it wasn't because the weather was different. And then suddenly his face changed, and he said, "You are right. That's one I took myself when I came through." And from then on, the whole atmosphere changed. If he's telling the truth there, he might be telling the truth on this other stuff too. And we became the best of friends.
Wow.
And we've since had a lot of contact with that family.
Wow.
Including grandchildren coming to stay with us and visiting them in Japan. So
incredible.
It's been quite an interesting experience.
Yeah. Something you would have never wished happened, but
Exactly.
has brought out some sort of benefits.
We still communicate quite
But
well.
I guess that whole feeling of having to, going over trying to do the right thing for the families, and then almost having to take a harsher stand because you know you're right on that case, must have been sort of a bit of a funny thing to go through in your mind, because you're trying to show some emotion in the whole thing, aren't you, and not be too harsh. And,
yes. It's quite a cultural aspect to it too, trying to understand what is acceptable and what is the correct way of handling things.
But a very commendable thing to go and do. I mean, not many business owners would go to the country of, the people who had passed away to show their respect. And
well, it was good for me. It was a challenge, but it probably helped me quite a lot to go and talk to them and go through that. And the people were great, lovely families.
We've talked a lot about your aircraft types you've had over the years, but there's a couple we haven't mentioned. So, and I'm sure have had a huge effect on your business. So one is the Airvan and the Caravan, and also the helicopters. So just briefly, how did you come about flying the Airvan in your operation?
Well, Graham and I had carried on the business from when I left Mesopotamia through to 2002, and coincidentally 2002 was when I turned 60, and I decided that would be the time to change. So we looked at all sorts of various ways of moving ahead, restructuring, whatever. But in the end, it made most sense for me to take over Graham's share, and we'd run the company as a family business from then, with Tim with me, of course. So in 2002, we were ready to make some quite big changes. It was a big thing for us as a family because we had to take over the whole company, and quite a big financial challenge. But we decided there was some doubt about the support for the Nomads, the Government Aircraft Factories or Aerospace Technologies of Australia, as they were then, and through various entities, were talking about pulling the pin on supporting the Nomad. And we thought the Cessna Grand Caravan would be our next option. So Tim had gone over to Australia to America,
Yep.
to Wichita,
Yep.
and he'd gone to a Flight Safety Foundation or official course on the Caravan, and to his surprise, when he got there, they were so busy they could only let him fly in the simulator at night. So he did all his type rating at night time, and while he was over there doing that, and also meeting the chap that we were going to buy the first Caravan from, out of the blue, this aircraft arrived on our runway, and it was an Airvan, a GA8 Airvan, with quite a team, including a very good bloke that you'll know up in Blenheim, who was the New Zealand agent, because it was a bit of an offshoot from the Fat Man G200, is the GA200 eggplane.
So that was Ray Patchett with it,
Ray
was it?
Patchett,
Yeah.
great chap, and several others, including the test pilot from Gippsland Aeronautics. And they arrived on an afternoon that we were pretty busy. And we gave them a bit of a cold shoulder, really, because we were so busy and they hadn't arranged to come. But when we'd finished flying for the day, they decided to stay the night, and we put the aircraft in the hangar. And then three of us, I think Tim, Jeff, and I, walked around it in silence for a minute and had a good look at it. And then we finally looked at each other and said, "This is our aircraft." So we actually bought the demonstrator on the spot.
Oh.
And then Tim wasn't there. He was in Wichita. Must have been Jeff and I and others. And I had to break the news to Tim, who was doing his Caravan conversion, that we'd actually bought an Airvan. And we've often used the term, it was the best thing since sliced bread for us.
Yeah.
Great little aeroplane.
Yeah. Yeah. And so did you carry on with the Caravan?
Yes. Yes, it was a pretty big commitment.
Yeah, also.
We've taken a few gambles over the years, but the Airvan has proved a great success, obviously. The guys that designed it, funnily enough, some of them had worked on the Nomad previously, but they'd put a lot of thought into ergonomics and just things like having an aisle down the middle.
Yeah.
A very good CFG range, and a very good payload, and just a great little performer, and a lovely little aeroplane to fly. But anyway, Tim having done the course over in Wichita, we then had quite a lot of fun dealing with the Americans we were buying the Caravan from, Grand Caravan. It was quite an interesting negotiation in terms of how the deal would be done. And they insisted on ferrying the aircraft to New Zealand. They didn't want us to ferry it. And there was quite a lot of fun about at what point during its ferry that we transferred funds to them to be over a certain state,
right?
That sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So
big time problems.
They were using I think a Scottish ferry company. And I said, well, the only thing is we want to make sure it's a pilot that's really experienced with a Caravan and turbines. And they said, oh yeah, that'll be the case. And a hell of a nice guy turned up with it, Tekapo, eventually. And the first thing he said, when he went to get the Caravan, it was the first time he'd seen one.
Really?
Really.
Wow. Scary for you.
But the Caravan, of course, has proved a wonderful aeroplane for the job.
Yeah. So if you had to pick one aircraft type, I don't know if this is possible for you, over all the years that's changed the shape of your business and made it what it is today, could you pick one?
Probably not. The Porter certainly changed the shape of our business. It was a pretty distinctive aeroplane. And I don't think I'd single out a single aeroplane because they've all had their attributes.
Yeah, and I suppose at various times and needs of the business, they've all come in and filled their role.
Exactly. Yeah, the Nomads, they were very much a milestone for us.
Yeah.
And the Caravan, the Airvan. Yeah.
And of course, you've got the Long Ranger now as well.
Well, Tim, because when we first started, there were no helicopter flights. So we were it's just really us and the ski planes flying in the Alps. And took quite a while for the helicopters to really take off in the area, but then snow landings became a big thing.
Yeah.
And we'd always had to compete with the ski planes landing on the snow. And our biggest attribute was we were much less affected by the weather with our flights from Tekapo, away from the divide, and not having to rely on landing on the glacier. But the helicopters were a bit different because they started to get reasonably, for a start, they weren't really flying other than on very good days, but then they were flying a lot more regularly, and were quite hard for us to compete without overflights, if you like. And Tim decided, this is again after 2002 when we had the business on our own, that we probably needed to have a helicopter operation to balance things and make it a lot easier to convince people, because we had both options to fly in our aircraft. Because, of course, we had all the capacity in the fixed one. The largest helicopter was going to be 6 passengers, usually 5. Whereas we could, we had pretty high capacity for coach tours with the Nomads and the Caravan and the Airvans. So Tim started with the Robbie 44, and he did extremely well, actually, taking it very carefully, did things properly and very conservative, and learned a lot very quickly, as did I, because my only memories of helicopters was flying with John Reed way back early days of Nelson Helicopters, and then later with Bill Black, actually, in a Herbie Hiller. And my overriding impression was all that stuff going around up there, and will it hold together? But Tim has successfully established his flights with a helicopter, and then again, unfortunately, the Robbie 44 became a bit of a much maligned little helicopter, but also he was limited on capacity. We went to the Bell Long Ranger, and that's been very successful for him.
Slightly different subject. You've obviously employed a lot of pilots over the years, given a lot of people a start. What do you look for in new pilots today? What key attributes are you really looking for when you employ a pilot?
That's probably changed a bit, actually, Craig. We're certainly looking for more than just a pilot. We're looking for somebody who will enjoy living in this area, who's prepared to get out and dig snow, because we haven't talked about snow, but of course one of our biggest issues here is quite heavy snowfalls through the winter. People who are good dealing with people, pilots who are good with dealing with the public, enjoy flying in the mountains and are relaxed flying in the mountains, and prepared to get stuck in and do other jobs as well, because the nature of the job is that we get a huge amount of downtime. And we went from leasing the ground to actually owning the ground that the airfield's on, so we've got an aerodrome to maintain and look after, hangars. We've been very lucky with the pilots who we've had, and the people we've had. And, most have moved on to the airline eventually, to an airline, some to helicopters, and some have actually come back from airline jobs to us.
Nice.
And I think one thing that gives me a lot of pleasure still is that a lot of our older pilots who flew with us decades ago still make contact or give us a call going overhead and pop in, and it's great to see that they've had successful careers after starting from scratch with us.
Yeah, exactly. If there's young pilots watching this and would really like to work for Air Safaris or a company like you, what would you recommend they work on?
Well, I've seen a lot of quite frustrated young pilots over the years desperately trying to get a job and not being able to get a break. And what I've always said is, it doesn't matter what you're doing, give it your best shot, because it's all good experience, whether it's flying or some other job in the meantime. Stick with it, and I think be prepared to do the hard yards. So in the early days, we were mainly dealing with young chaps who'd come through aero clubs, swept hangars, started from grassroots, so to speak. Whereas these days, it's more people who've been through quite high pressure pilot training. So there is a difference there. We've had a lot of success with pilots from farming background in this area, with the just living in this area, shoveling snow, that sort of stuff. But a lot of good young chaps have come through.
In terms of the pilot training, do you see a difference today versus 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago in terms of the quality of training? And do pilots that come to you now have the skills, required to do what you need of them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think most of the young pilots these days will have gone through instrument ratings and so on. Whereas in those early days, that wasn't the case. We used to be concerned that we were dealing with young pilots who'd been trained by an instructor who'd only just got an instructor rating and been trained by somebody before them and so on. So the depth of experience wasn't very great. I think that's probably slightly different now with the training organisations. Certainly in terms of flying schools, because obviously for us, people skills is pretty important too. In terms of flying skills, crosswinds, profiles, speed control are things that I've found over the years I've had to work on a lot with new pilots.
Right, interesting. And I guess, it's a fairly extreme environment here, and, the terrain is pretty high and a lot of extreme weather that most people haven't seen before, no matter what sort of training you get.
Yep.
On a personal level, you've said you're 81 and you're the CEO. Still the check and training manager, I think?
No, not really. I do quite a lot of check and training.
Oh, right.
But that's really Tim's role.
Yeah. But you still carry out checks and training?
Yep.
What does a typical day look like for you?
I don't think we have a typical day. It's very variable. But normally we do a weather reading, temperatures, rainfall, so on for NIWA, first thing, getting the terminal ready. I'd spend a lot of time talking with the guys. We do a lot of tea drinking and a lot of chewing the fat, particularly on safety, risk assessment, all that sort of thing around the table. And I guess probably business advisors are very hot about telling us we should be working on the business, not in it. And
as a CEO?
All the way through, really, running the business. And rightly or wrongly, I've always felt that working in the business has been really important for us here. I think particularly the sort of flying we do in the area and the conditions we have to fly in, with wind particularly, I've again, rightly or wrongly, felt it was really important to be out there showing the guys that you're not asking them to do anything that you wouldn't do yourself, and leading the way, if you like. So I'd probably get criticised for that, but that's the way we've operated.
And it's worked very well, obviously.
It's worked for a long time. And you know, you've got to be really out and amongst it to see what the culture's like with
Yep.
safety, passenger, customer service. So if you're out and amongst it, you can see what's going on, and also a lot of mentoring too of the newer pilots and encouraging.
Do you have a life outside of air safaris? A funny story again. Talking to Reg Taylor last week, he mentioned he was at an AIA conference, and he mentioned you won a trip to Hong Kong.
That's right.
And Roz made a mention, oh, that's great, but I'll never get him away from work.
I think it was Bangkok, actually. Years ago, the local little squash club ran a triathlon as a fundraiser, which involved a run up to the top of over Mount John, the local mountain, a short kayak on the lake, and then a bike circuit on the canal system road. And we used to sponsor it. And one night, I must have said, when the kids were at school, we were around the table, and I said, oh, I wouldn't mind having a crack at that. And when they picked themselves up from rolling around on the floor laughing at the idea of Dad doing a triathlon, I said, oh, all right. So the next one, I borrowed my daughter's bike and a kid's kayak and did it. And then I started to get a bit interested in this. I found it actually really relaxing to get out and jog a bit. And then my great friend Keith Mitchell, who ran the heliline operation from Timaru at the time, called me up one day, and apparently they had been supporting by helicopter the coast to coast for a number of years. And Keith had apparently said to Robin Judkins, Mr. Coast to Coast, that I reckon it looks pretty easy from the helicopter. And Judkins said, right, you put a team together and you do it. And Keith couldn't get any starters down there to join them as a team, so he rang me up and said, look, Richie, he said, I'd like to do the coast to coast, but I need somebody to do the run for me. Would you join? I had no idea what it involved at all. I said, oh, okay. And that started a bit of a love affair with the coast to coast. It went on for 10 or 12 years.
Wow.
Daily, each year.
Yeah.
But I did find that the getting out and jogging, going home over Mount John each night, a very good change of pace and relaxing.
Yeah, I bet.
Good up here.
Yeah. If you look where you are now in your business with Air Safaris, is this your dream? If you could see where you are now back in 1966, would this be where you wanted to be?
I don't think we ever dreamt to be here. So it's sort of evolved. Would I do it differently? I don't have any regrets. We've had a hell of an adventure all the way through. A lot of very exciting times, probably a bit selfish at times. But I don't think I've ever had dreams of some, highfalutin airline type arrangement. I just enjoy doing it so much.
Yeah. You've won 3 Directors' Awards. This is a Civil Aviation Directors' Awards for safety, one shared with other tourism members. So 1996, 2002 and 2016. What does it take to win a Directors' Award for safety? What are they looking for? Do you think you deserved them? Did it make you proud to be the recipient of those?
I don't particularly see me as a recipient. I see it as recognition of our team, if you like. One of them was in recognition of a huge amount of work that Jeff Ensor, when he was our chief pilot, did for informing the tourist flight operators group, trying to raise the bar a bit, raise standards. I don't know really what it takes to win an award, but I certainly see it as a team thing, not an individual thing. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am without the team behind us.
In a Vector magazine in 2016, you said that safety is embedded in the company ethos. It's not just the pre-winter and pre-summer briefing. Day-to-day safety practices are front and centre of every employee's mind. And this is something that I've heard a lot of companies say. It's on a lot of people's websites, but it's actually a very different thing to say this and then practice it day in, day out. What does it take, in your opinion, to create a great safety culture in an organisation?
I think that goes back to my comment about working with the guys in the company, is I think you can only really assess what that culture's like if you're in there working with them, watching. Really important to set the sort of example you want everybody else to follow. Be honest about any mistakes you've made, and I've made a few. We all make mistakes, and as much as possible you want to learn from other people's mistakes, but certainly don't want to be too judgmental on people making mistakes, and help them and mentor them, and really encourage a no-nonsense safety policy. I've always said that we're not going to have something go wrong because we were deliberately doing something stupid. And the guys have supported that very well.
So you mentioned a no-nonsense safety policy. How do you see safety today as in terms of policy and processes and procedures being or comparing to back when you started? Do we do it better now, or do we overdo it? Because, one question I had is, if you take SMS processes today, where we do we're meant to do very thorough risk assessments and mitigate risks. If we had SMS back in place in 1966, I would hazard a guess that you would have never gone to Mark's Flat, because the risks would just be far outweigh, any benefits. And if that's true, then everything you've achieved, wouldn't have even started. So how do you compare that, the benefits of safety today versus back then?
I've got a very simple attitude to SMS. Basically, it's how the human being operates. I've been involved with quite a lot of conferences and presentations on SMS, and I've seen some very complicated consultants, some of which to me was gobbledygook on SMS. To me, it's very simple. That it's a bit like crossing a highway. We recognise the risk, high-speed traffic. We come up with a plan to cross and do it safely, and then monitor the fact we got to the other side carefully. We get into a hot shower. We have a procedure. We put our hand in the hot water. Yep, that's right temperature. We get in, feels good. So I think that's the way the human being actually operates. And it's a sort of culture that I think we've always worked in here. Assess the risk, and we were doing this way before we had official SMS systems.
So what you're saying is, back in when you went to Mark's Flat, you actually practiced it. You managed the risks, you dealt with them. It might not have been documented how we're meant to do today, but you were doing the same thing.
We certainly assessed the risk. I knew that it was going to be a fair challenge. And of course, my biggest fear was hurting somebody else, which was we weren't responsible for a lot of passengers. We have to be a lot more formal now, and a lot more responsibility to other people. Making people responsible for their own actions is a very important thing too. We tend to try and come up with systems to totally stop anybody from making mistakes, but people have to have a sense of responsibility for their own actions. And I think we've tried to instill that.
What would you say to people today who want to do something different in their lives, but it just seems too big or too risky or maybe too expensive? A bit like you buying a 180 instead of a house. What advice would you give to people today, not just in the aviation industry?
Like poor Ros watching the Pilatus Porter fly over and saying, "That's my house going overhead."
Exactly.
It drops out of the sky. Yeah. I think you really don't know whether you're going to succeed or not until you give it a go. And I think giving something your best shot and making a go of it is very rewarding in itself. And sure, some things won't work. We've had a lot of setbacks over the years, a lot of challenges, but a lot of satisfaction too from dealing with challenges.
If I can just quote another paragraph out of your book, which I liked in this vein. In discussion, obstacles seemed almost insurmountable. How would we get on selling the venison? What about fuel and maintenance for the aircraft? How would the notorious Westland weather affect us? The biggest question mark hung over the aeroplane. We had calculated that we should be able to run our aircraft for about $14 an hour compared to the $35 to $40 it would cost us to charter an aircraft. The big question was, how would I, with so little experience, cope with the type of flying we would encounter? At this time, all my flying had been in the Australian-built Victor aircraft from the mile-long runway at Wellington Airport. I had no illusions as to my own limited capabilities. So is taking risks a good thing? Just, if we look at a big picture here, how does someone know when that line of negatives outweighs the positives? Or is it just about having a go?
I think that was certainly very much, even way back then, very much in my mind is, what is the level of risk? How stupid is it what we're doing? I guess you could ask a mountain climber why they take the risks they take. A lot of it's calculated. And I guess I was very conscious of the fact we were doing something a bit daring, but very exciting. And I think that made me particularly cautious. And took things very quietly for a start because I'm starting from very low experience. Perhaps if I could just make a wee parallel, that when I was operating in and out of those little strips on the west coast daily, it was very easy, whereas with hundreds of times the amount of flying now, if I went back in there I'd really struggle. So it's what you get used to.
Interesting. Yeah.
Got very familiar with them, and
Yeah.
it was a daily thing.
Yeah.
And I gradually progressed to where I had that confidence.
Just thinking about ethics in business. Your company, Safaris, feels different to most, and a lot of people say this. It really, it is a family business. It feels like a family business. Anyone I've known who stops in to say hello, there's always a biscuit and a cup of tea there. That's obviously something you've made an effort to create. Maybe it's just the way you are.
We do drink a lot of tea.
Have you ever struggled personally with the challenge of running a business, being a businessman, having to make some tough decisions and challenging situations, as you've mentioned, but still holding up to those ethical standards?
Oh yes, I've had my ups and downs. I guess you would say it in mental well-being. But you touched on before what I'd say to somebody trying to start out on something like this, that a lot of things look insurmountable. They look like almost impossible challenges, but it's amazing when you get stuck into them how you can overcome the challenges and make it work. And that's been the case for us with a lot of the developments of the company, that it looked like more than we could possibly handle, but in the end it wasn't actually as bad as we thought.
Yep.
My mother, bless her heart, had a good saying, don't worry, it may never happen, about things in the future. And we obviously we've had to go through COVID. We operate for 3 years on about 5% of our normal income, and we've had huge weather issues, long periods of bad weather keeping everything on the ground, and some pretty horrific snowstorms over the years. So the human spirit is pretty strong.
Graham Harris in 2016, who was the director of the Civil Aviation, mentioned at the time Richard's company has seeded New Zealand and international aviation with pilots that have been moulded by a caring, highly skilled and inspirational man who believes that leading by example trumps all other components of effective leadership. What does it mean to you to be a leader?
I think I really enjoy being out with the guys, being out there. And I think setting an example, mentoring has been really important for me. Being a friend, I'd like to think all our pilots have been good friends, and some lifelong friends. And it's always operated very much as a family rather than employees.
A few last questions. What's been the low point, or what were the low points in the 60 years?
Well, obviously the accident with the Cardinal was a terrible low point. That brought the team close together here. The night of that accident, I had all the guys around here. We sat around the table and talked about that, how we were going to get through it. I've been blessed to actually have more high points than low points.
Okay, well, let's go there, because that's my next question. What have your euphoria points been?
The excitement of operating the new types. The Pilatus Porter, the ski plane, they're all in their own right adventures that we went through, and were exciting. The Grand Caravan, big step for us. The Nomads, really enjoyed the IFR flying, and probably for me, rather than a single point, having the variation of perhaps bush flying to scheduled IFR, and even doing two on the same day, has been very good. That actually brings another quick point, that we've obviously flown a lot of different types, and I have a bit of a thing about flying different types. I tend to liken it to when you first learn to drive a car. For a lot of people, I'm sure, they learn to drive in a particular car and they're quite good at that car, but it's a big jump to start driving different makes and so on. I feel it's a bit the same with aeroplanes, that if you're only flying one particular type, you'll get good in that type, but find it quite difficult to fly something different. Whereas for us, regularly swapping from one type to the other, I think has kept the skills very good. As much as possible, we've kept checks and so on generic and very similar for each type, but it's worked very well flying various types, and that's probably added a lot to the enjoyment. And rather than specific moments of high points.
And that's something that Willie Sage mentioned, in the interview that I had with him, is that people flying one type get very, very good at it,
Yep.
but a lot of it's muscle memory. People
Yep.
flying more than one type regularly need to engage the brain a lot more and
Yep.
really think about what they're doing.
Yep,
Mm.
I think so.
How will you know when it's time to hang your head up, Richard?
Probably when they wheel me out in the coffin. Yep. No, well, it's been a big thing to have my family involved, and Tim has been my right-hand man for so long, and we're fortunate that we're such good friends. I've now got grandsons who may well, it's their choice, but they may well want to get involved. I'm gradually moving more out of it. Tim's wife, Penny, is helping him a lot, doing a lot of the administration, which perhaps in the earlier days I would have done. So I think I'm probably well past my use-by date, but still they haven't tossed me out yet, and I still enjoy going out and mixing with the good young guys we've got is good for me.
One last question. You're getting back to Mark's Flat, amazing opportunity. If you were to start again in 2023, but you were 23 years old again, where would be the Mark's Flat of today? Are there the opportunities today that there was back then, or maybe there's more?
Very hard to think like a 23-year-old or 24-year-old. I think we were lucky in those days because we could do those sorts of things, whereas now we couldn't. Mark's Flat's now a wilderness area. You technically can't land an aeroplane in there anyway. So is the Garden of Eden, where I used to land the ski planes. Probably more difficult for young people today. Are we a more restrictive society? I don't know.
I think we definitely are.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a shame, isn't it?
It's a bit sad. Yeah. But I'm sure that there are different challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never really got totally into today's world of emails and computers and programs and so on. I have to get my grandchildren to show me how some of that stuff works. So I guess there are different areas now where young people are going to get their challenges, and
maybe creating a podcast.
Well, there we go. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure and an honour to spend some time with you and speak with you, and what you and your family and the people around you have created is incredible. And well done.
Thanks, great. It's been nice talking to you, and it's very hard to put this much time into a few words, isn't it?
And we've missed, 95% of the story, I know, but hopefully we've covered some of the key points and interesting points.